Baik, thank you. Terima kasih, Professor Tessa. Very interesting topics, and I can see some consistency. It's the same things that was expressed maybe in a little bit different language with the first facilitators. Just mentioned several things. For example, about the authentic interactions to demonstrate what the student do and can do, and you also mentioned that in a different language, which is the assessment should be drawn from basically the interactions between teachers and the student. The second one is about formative assessment, and also in the language that mentioned is an assessment that very useful for education, for example. Some great idea. Okay, thank you very much for the presentations. We are now coming into the question and answer session. However, before that, I'm sorry to all the participants to take a freedom here, which is to ask the two presenters or facilitators today to put those ideas into the context of Indonesia. Statistic of Indonesia, we have about 44 million children aged between 0 to 9, which is school age children or early childhood. And currently we have about 91,000 what's so-called PAUD, early childhood education school, or actually that's only the play group. Now within this large context with with the huge area, so from the West Indonesia, 3 time zone, how we are how are we going to implement, or what are the right pathway for those two ideas of early childhood assessment in Indonesia? For example, in Indonesia, one school teacher maybe has about 20, 30, 40 students in the classroom, for example, with a very limited resources. I just wonder if each of you can address this. Maybe we can start from there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, just the small, easy question there. Generalize this to the Indonesian context. I think I'm quite fortunate because I've been able to visit Java at least many times in Jakarta and in Bogor, and visit PAUD programs. I've been able to sit and watch TK programs run during the morning and talk to educators. I don't think many of the challenges are wildly different from challenges that we find in the region, challenges that we find internationally. Almost certainly one of the biggest challenges in Indonesia is the professionalization of the early childhood workforce. We know that many early childhood educators are mostly volunteers. They are very motivated, well-intentioned people who rely on the local government to provide a stipend through the mother of PAUD or the Penilik. There's insecurity in what services are funded. And I think that's part of the reason why we observe in Indonesia many children entering school much earlier than we would like them to. So children should typically enter school at age 7. In Indonesia, after 2 years, little TK and big TK. In our work at ICAL, we've observed 4- and 5-year-olds already in school. And families often tell us it's because they prioritize academic school-age learning over early childhood programs. So, almost certainly there's a big challenge to bring enough resourcing, funding, and esteem into the sector, so that, you know, in your local community, families are looking to the preschool services, seeing, you know, wonderful play-based learning and valuing that kind of program, and sending their children there rather than straight into school. I think that's a very, very big challenge that's going to take a long time to address. I think it's got to do with the funding model. It's got to do with the teacher accreditation and training model. I remember seeing a question in the chat which mentioned that the curriculum framework, or at least the outcomes framework, the STPPA in Indonesia, has elements that are not typically seen in other countries, including morality and religiosity, and how do we think about that in terms of assessment. But I would say that's the biggest challenge. The other area that, of course, I'm interested in is well, no, actually, I'll leave it there. I think, you know, I think issues of quality and equity of access flow naturally from building esteem in the sector, expanding it, and making sure, you know, it's something that is valued by families and that is used in preference to school. So, Marek, I might give you an opportunity to have your say.
Thanks, Dan. And as you said, a very easy question, and really easy to answer that and resolve this issue. I agree with what Dan is saying, and I would just add that I always feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about countries or contexts where I do not live. And there are so many 140 experts here in the room that could have a great debate. This would be great sort of conversation to have and to think with people. And also the work I always done with Indonesia was done with local researchers. And but I would agree that the work with the sector and work with the resourcing as that's currently available is really important, because I think it really matters where you are as a teacher and where you are located as a family in Indonesia. I mean, families have a very different stories if they are in Sulawesi or Kalimantan or in Java or in Sumatra. I mean, there are very different stories that we have encountered, consistently different stories and narratives that we've heard from families from different parts of Indonesia. And I think getting some sort of an and there's a question of access, but if there is one thing that I think is really important, and that I would say, and I'm always looking at it from a little bit academic perspective as a sort of teacher educator and an academic researcher, I always think that there is we can't always change the policy, you know, from day to day, and we can't do that, and we can't change the resourcing, and we can't change the structure how it is, and the generational sort of poverty and so on. But one thing that we could do, we can work with the workforce better and more sort of effectively, and think, for example, about leadership in early childhood education. I think there is an idea of strong and better and high quality leadership, leaders that can inspire teams and think differently about the way how early childhood education is set up is really powerful. But I'm also aware that during the pandemic, but also before, teachers have been really struggling, and there's been a lot of pressure on teachers. So this is I'm always conscious that answering this question almost means like pointing finger, where is the problem, which I'm not trying to do at all. I'm just trying to say that from my perspective, if I always imagine if I would be teleported to Indonesia today, where would I start working and supporting? It would be in that area, I think, because that's one of the immediate things that could be done. But there are other researchers or other thinkers with different skill sets that could differently think how to contribute. So yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, let me now thank you for your take, both of you, on this issue. Now we have, according to the notes, we have actually 9 questions. Let me address the first one, which is to Dan. what is it about verbal ability that led you to use it as a measure of overall ability in your 2015 study? What measure of verbal ability was used? I think it's referring to your writing before.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Greta. Everybody, Greta is one of the leaders of early childhood assessment and research and test design here at ACER. Very, very pleased to hear that she's here and listening. She might have also been a good speaker for the future, Lani. Let me go a slightly different way with the answer to that question. And first of all, say, in that study, we didn't only use verbal ability as an outcome measure. We captured general intelligence, verbal ability, working memory, social and emotional skills, and some academic skills like following directions. And I wouldn't necessarily champion that measure of verbal ability as a good outcome measure. So, 2010 through to 2016, when we ran that study, that was a lifetime ago. I was a different researcher back then. It came from the Woodcock-Johnson tests of cognitive achievement and academic achievement. And I think back then, our thinking was very much, well, there's not a lot of good quality assessment in the early years space for the purpose of research. And so we borrowed measures from the psychological assessment space. And whilst it's a very good measure, the scales are Rorsch measures. They have nice linear properties. They are measures that can only be used by qualified psychologists. They do exclude educators, and they're very, very narrow in what they measure. And I think picking up on some of the themes in my presentation, they're not the kind of measures we would choose as good outcome measures, because they aren't educational in that sense, that they're not measuring things that are the breadth and the verticality, the kind of learning progression side of things that represent what educators are primarily concerned with. They capture a very narrow set of skills. But in that period, a long time ago, and I would never do it again, it was a very good measure that strongly correlated with, I think, better, more well-rounded measures of children's learning outcomes. So do as I say, not as I do.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the second question for this discussion. It's addressed to Professor Tesser. The question is, it common happens easy early childhood learning situations and assessment, arranging curriculum and other dominant provide by adult and adult people perspective also. So it was taken from the perspective of adult. How can children bring their own practices? Professor Tesser.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really like Dan's answer to it because I think that every researcher should have a time machine to go back and rethink some of their studies or writing. So I hope no one is picking up on my 2011 article. But I guess what I'm trying, I think this is an excellent question because I think it's at the core and is at the core of the idea that how to really think about curriculum and how to think about assessment and how to think about the link between them and whose perspective we really value. And I can speak about New Zealand or some other also frameworks, but what really underpins curriculum frameworks there is really that philosophical idea of a child at the center. And also when we were establishing Seameo Chechep, we made sure that the child was at the center, not the adult, the center. So everything what happens with respect to research and capacity building and training and advocacy. It's focusing on a child. And that's really important. And the question that we've been asking for 20 years here, in New Zealand, it's always been is, so, okay, so of course we develop the assessment practice, adults are leaders and they do work, but where are the children in those practices? I mean, it's coming from sociology of childhood, obviously, that whole 80s, 90s turn towards the importance of a child that sort of has translated into early childhood and educational practices. But the question is that, can children really bring their own practices? And the question is, of course they can. But the real question is to adults, what do we actually actively do to recognize them and really value them? How do we really make them count and what it actually matters? Often when we work with the children's ideas or children's worldviews or children's thinking, it is, I'm being often challenged with the thought that, so are you saying that we should just all accept what children are saying as a truth and enter it into the reports? And no, not at all. It's about working with it and treating children's ideas seriously. I mean, great example is one of my PhD students. She's in a fabulous work and where they talked about the earthquakes, and we know both that, and volcanoes, and Indonesia is prone to those the same as New Zealand, so we share those concerns. And the idea is that, so if children have developing those working theories, and we talk about the recent events, and they're thinking about those monsters that are getting really grumpy and jumping up and down on the ground, so everything is shaking. It's not the first thought of an adult, shouldn't be dismissing that as a idea, but it's a great idea of how to start working and really triggering children's interest and building a whole weeks and weeks long of exploration and thinking and learning into different curricular areas that leads towards quite a strong assessment about what has been actually learned. It's about taking that idea and working it through, not dismissing it as a fairy tale, because of course we know there are not monsters jumping up and down, or tsunami is not caused by that, so that's really important. So I think it is about, yes, they bring their own practices. It's also about respecting and asking always children, what do they think? How do they feel? What are their choices? Can you do this or that or that? That's fundamental in those micro practices, make the macro differences in children's learning and child's development, and rethinking how they become competent, confident learners. But the work needs to be done by adults, by the practitioners, by the teachers. So it's not just automatic. It's the same thing as no one becomes a parent overnight because your child is born and you know everything about parenting. There is a learning involved, so in everything. So that would be my answer. Thank you for that wonderful question.
All right. Thank you, Professor Tessar. Well, okay, now let's take the next question, which addressed to both of you. Can we choose the question that was addressed to the two speakers, please? Okay, this one from in the subsidiary. The question is, I agree with you that assessment should have followed up by in student achievement should link the curriculum, collaborative work within school and home, as well as measuring student holistic development. Now the question is, how to ensure authentic assessment in early childhood, since parents, I think this is a specific maybe Indonesia, want to do students' work, or some behavior can be observed in classroom or playground activities. Maybe Dan first.
Yeah, of course. I think we'll have two quite different answers to this question, right? I think it's clear. I'm a quantitative researcher, right? One of the things I'm particularly interested in is how do we manifest play? How do we manifest these loosely defined skills and abilities, and create some sort of way of yielding an objective measure of them. And so mostly my interest is about, when I talk about authentic interactions in assessment, is saying, well, we don't need to sit children down at a table and say, do this maths test to measure their mathematical ability. And in fact, we can do it through conversation. We can do it through activities, and perhaps we can do it through observation. But my work thinks about what formal structure can we put around that sort of authentic interaction, those typical everyday interactions, to turn them into objective measures. And so in that sense, I would say nearly everything that we're primarily interested in measuring about children's learning, we can ask children to demonstrate for us through some interaction. And I'm a bit biased, and you know, maybe just for entertainment purposes, I get a bit down on indirect assessment, you know, where parents rate children on a questionnaire, or, you know, teachers fill out a checklist kind of thing to capture something about measurement. I think we can get creative and put that objective layer over interactions, but it does mean we have to impose some regularity. And I saw another question in the chat about, you know, if we're going to allow, encourage, support educators to do this kind of assessment, how do we know they're doing it consistently? Well, you know, we know that because of training and education, and through our initial teacher education, giving educators that skill, and, you know, talking to them about the kind of things Marek was talking about, you know, different kinds of assessment for different purposes. You know, if I'm trying to generate evidence against a kind of learning progression that I want to share amongst other educators, I want to, you know, compare the kind of development trajectory I observe in one child with another, well, then you need to put that regularity, that kind of formal measurement layer over the top of it. And that's what I'm mainly interested in. I think if you are going down the kind of learning stories or portfolio perspective, narrative-driven approaches to assessment, that's very different, and something Marek is much better to comment on now. So I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think what Dan's saying is correct. I think that there is something absolutely wonderful about education and research, how diverse it is and how many different perspectives there are. I often work with quantitative researchers while they provide the overall attitude and overview of things, I then drill down in particular early childhood centers and try to really see how it actually is demonstrated and what's actually happening. My real interest in early childhood education is to make sure that each and every child really benefits in early childhood education. I think that's some of the things that then talked at the very beginning about those shared outcomes that we sort of, while we are in early childhood education, with, of course, we have different hats on and different trainings and different ways. I was thinking how to answer that question, because it's a really important question, and how to sort of think and ensure authentic assessment in early childhood. It depends, what do we understand as authentic? Is a philosophical question. I mean, what is authentic? Can there be can there be an objective assessment? Can there be an sort of kind of key? Can we actually do that? But I would say that one thing that I've learned over the years, over the many years I've been working in the early childhood sector with different hats on, one thing that I think I found the most powerful and important for, and if we look at any early childhood center anywhere in the world, is the idea that things are not just delivered for them, but they have a particular agency in doing things that really matter for them in that local setting. And I think there is something about things being more open than closed, like, for example, pedagogical practices, regulations, curriculum frameworks and so on that allow the variations and assessment practices that allow the variations than what's the mainstream. Because we tend to think that best for a child and for early childhood center is what's the most common successful occurrence in particular study, and that's not always the case. And that's why, for example, if you come to New Zealand, which I all invite you now, the borders are open, is that you will find out that while we have a one curriculum framework for the whole country, every early childhood center, and I can see Dan, sort of thinking, oh my God, what she's going to say is that interprets it completely differently and does something completely different in a way how they interpret what's the best possible for their local community. And there is something, on one hand, a little bit concerning, and on the other hand, something really beautiful if you have a right workforce, right leadership, and the right decision making that makes the best decisions for the children. So there is there are many different ways how to think of authentic assessment and how to sort of make the best possible decisions. But I think it's really important to consider that we are very diverse. And we are very diverse in every country, in our communities, and not everything suits every family and every child. And why I am in early childhood education is to make sure, and it's one of my biggest concerns, is how do we support every child and every family in there and create a successful educational futures for them. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mark. Very interesting. Let's now take another questions. This is question number 3. Could you provide, this is to Dan Clooney, could you provide non-educational and educational measure practices commonly conducted in Australia early education context? Okay, please.
I can. I think I'll be better off providing some links in the chat, and I'll do that in between questions. Over the last few years, we have been asked, ACER have been asked to produce some literature reviews for the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority on assessment in the early years and how it aligns to our curriculum framework, the Early Years Learning Framework, and in Victoria, the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework. And in that work, we do a kind of classic academic activity where we go to the literature and we say, okay, well, what kind of assessment is out there to measure, for example, one of the curriculum outcomes in Australia, which is that children have a strong sense of identity. I don't think you'll be surprised to know that there's relatively little literature on assessment of identity that aligns strongly with education, something that an educator would use. Certainly the kind of thing that Marek talks about has come up very strongly, those kind of narrative-driven approaches, those highly contextualized approaches, and that's probably the dominant early educational approach in Australia to assessing most of the outcomes in our learning framework. But there certainly are other measures, and this really is about what hat do you wear in children's learning. Certainly from the perspective of psychological development, there's lots of measures that are out there. But I think in those literature reviews, the critical perspective we take is that those are measures that are very narrow. Typically, in non-educational measurement, say psychological measurement, it's often strongly aligned with a clinical perspective. So, you might be a speech pathologist or a psychologist, and you have a very narrow definition of what, healthy identity or something like that means. The measures are often screener tools or diagnostic tools that really are just about allocating children to one bucket or the other. They're either typically developing or not typically developing. And if they're in the not typically developing bucket, we need to do some clinical intervention with them. And of course, that other critical perspective we took is a lot of the quantitative measurement excludes educators. You know, again, it requires a clinical qualification to use and interpret, and isn't, you know, useful in an educational setting. It's not something that you could readily see people embedding in their practice. So I'll share some links, and I think it's better to go and have a read of those documents. But I think the major non-educational and educational measurement divide is really, there is a particular tradition, particularly in Australia, around narrative-driven assessment and sociocultural perspectives around assessment. And in the non-educational, in the clinical kind of world, there is a much more classical and objective approach to assessment. I think neither of them by themselves is wholly sufficient for what we want. But my main interest at the moment is what is it that we should be developing for educators that gives them these kind of robust tools that helps them build understandings of learning and development within, you know, those kind of domains. You know, what domains are we interested in? What do they look like from low to high? What do they look like across the breadth of the domain? And then how do we construct kind of activities, interactions, those kind of things that manifest those skills and give us good quality measurement? But I'll share some links in the chat.
All right, thank you. Let's take the next question from Dr. Widiat Moko. The question was addressed to Professor Tesser. Is narrative assessment to some extent a sort of written corrective feedback? How do we consider student learning progress for quantifying such data in terms of score, this is quantitative, for certain period of learning, let's say one semester? Professor
Thank you for that question. Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for that question. And I'm also aware of the time, so I do not want to overstay my welcome. And so I just very briefly, narrative, I think there is an, in your question, you know, sort of you asking a very important question: can narrative, is a narrative assessment written corrective feedback? Well, not really. Narrative assessment is an assessment practice that's been, or learning stories as we call them, based upon work of Waikato colleagues, is very much very specific, and what I would say, if it's done well, a highly sophisticated and effective tool. If it's not done well, it can be quite superficial and not well done. But it's not just corrective feedback. It's about really capturing learning and capturing multiple voices that comes into assessment in that given time. And it recognizes both learning that's happening right now and learning that's happening over the time. It's if it's done well, it really captures the complexity of theory and complexity of findings and complexity of what's happening in a family of each child. And how do we quantify it? Well, that's not necessarily a question I would be asking, or I would be really interested in, because I'm not entirely sure what I will, how can I utilize such data in thinking how it can benefit that particular child or a family. I know that narrative assessment is successful if it's used and done well, if the portfolio is used in a way that child feels ownership of it, feels develops an identity, develops develops a particular learning dispositions associated with learnings and skills and knowledges, and rather than quantifying particular findings in them, albeit I know of some researchers who's done work in that space, and it's been very interesting to read it. But it's not something that I necessarily think would be that important. There is a I think that, and I just want to say it because there's something that's been the idea of quality or quality learning, of quality early childhood centers. When I walk into the early childhood center in New Zealand, for example, it doesn't matter where it is. You can pretty much understand the level of quality in 10 minutes you've spent there. If you know where to sort of look, you do understand where sort of things are and what actually is happening. And the same thing goes for the learning stories. If you open a portfolio, and I'm saying it also as a parent, you exactly know which one and how it was written, and where is the child's voice, where is the parent's voice, where is the captured opportunity, and where is the understanding of learning over the time, and where is the connectedness with the place and with the child's history. So that's something very, very critical. But I don't think that there is I don't see a necessary need for quantifying, but it can be certainly can be done in a certain way.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Pesar. I think we still have time at least for one more questions. So let's address this question number 6 to Danny, Dr. Clooney. You mentioned authentic interaction between educators and children. This is also highlighted or mentioned by Professor Pesar. This is something not too easy to measure, and according to my experience, may lead to too many bias in the data. I would like to hear some comments from you on this, please. I would also extend this question to Professor Pesar, because you also mentioned about this in a different terminology, right? Okay, Dan first, please. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a really good question, and very brave that we're short on time to give me this one, because I think we could talk for maybe half an hour on this. I'm going to give kind of a general answer, and I think part of it is, often as researchers or academics or quantitative sort of, empiricists or assessment people, we worry a lot about reliability, right? And that's led us down a path in, high stakes assessment, where we have to have very standardized approaches to assessment, because you can't let too many things vary. But the question in classrooms is really, well, how reliable, how accurate do I need my measure to be to give me something useful to work with? And I can imagine educators who have access to, say, good quality learning progressions, for example. We have some learning progression that describes, for example, oral language and literacy development. Educators could use informal approaches to assessment to align a child's approximate learning with that kind of learning progression, based solely on judgment, right? My familiarity with the child, what I've seen them produce and do. And in some settings, that might be precise enough to do something really useful in my teaching practice, right? And so, this kind of observational work in terms of assessment doesn't necessarily need to be precise enough to put into a multiple regression to answer the question, how effective was my teaching practice in the classroom? It can be very much about just collecting enough evidence to make an informed decision about what I'm going to plan and do next. I will agree, though, it is a challenge for us if we want to develop these measures to be precise enough to use in more formal contexts, for example, to use in research to make judgments about, whether activity X or program Y was effective and on average children grew at a faster rate. It is a really significant challenge then to develop assessments that are more authentic, that are built around interactions between adults and children, but still yield valid and reliable, and I mean that in the psychometric sense, measures. But I think it's very much a worthwhile pursuit, because I think the opposite, highly standardized assessments where we control, the interaction down to, some really abstract manifestation of the skill, for example, asking children to sight read words off a page. I think that has its own problems. It might be very valid and reliable from a psychometric perspective, but it's bloody boring for kids, and it's not very useful for educators. And so we've got to, in the psychometric sense, we've got to find that balance, engage with the challenge, develop assessment that's more interesting, more dynamic, more authentic, but wrap around it enough rigor, enough consistency that it yields useful measure for that purpose.
All right. Thank you, Red. Okay. In the interest of time, I think I have to stop the question and answer sessions. And thank you very much for everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Dan Clooney and Professor Tessar, for spending your valuable time with us, with also providing a valuable thought, a thought-provoking perspective that hopefully will enhance, will inspire our work to the future, especially in the area of assessment in the context of early childhood development. Dr. Dan, thank you also, Dr. For sharing the link. Already, everyone can download that on the chat. It's a very interesting, because basically it is a review of some of the currently popular and available assessment that will also give us an idea. Thank you very much for providing the papers. All right, dear friends, colleagues, everyone. So with this, I will return this to the host.